So I just got back from watching the new Denzel Washington movie, The Equalizer 2, and it is basically exactly what you would expect from a sequel. It's a movie that wants to be bigger and better than the original, but ends up being more of the same, just done a lot worse. For those who haven't seen the first movie, Denzel plays Robert McCall, an ex-assassin for the Agency, which is presumably some kind of CIA or government agency. He now lives a normal, quiet life, works for a Home Depot-like store, and spends a lot of time reading at a diner. He befriends a young prostitute named Terry, who's played by Chloe Grace Moretz. She aspires to be a singer, but she's controlled by the Russian mob. So when they beat her up, McCall takes matters into his own hands and uses his special skills to dispense his own brand of vigilante justice. And this sets off an elaborate cat-and-mouse game between McCall and the Russians. So what makes the first Equalizer so good is that it's a relatively focused story with broadly drawn but really well acted characters. It's set almost entirely in the big generic city, which gives it a quasi-realistic feel despite the ridiculous events that occur. The characters themselves are also given just enough character development to make us feel invested. Denzel Washington's acting is great as usual. As an actor, he can do so much with so little. I mean, just look at all the films he was in made by the late Tony Scott. His line delivery and all the little subtle character quirks and interactions all seem convincing. Sure, I mean, the villains too, they were all stock, but they didn't overact so egregiously as to take you out of the movie. The Equalizer also didn't resort to spoon-feeding the audience information. Most everything was show, don't tell. Even the smallest things like McCall's attention to his OCD, his habit of using a stopwatch, his love of reading, the whole character was meticulously introduced and developed. There were some exposition dumps, like when he visits his retired agency bosses, played by Melissa Leo and Bill Pullman, but it didn't drag the film down since at this point we knew so little of McCall's character that it basically served as much needed character development. As a film, it was also pretty stylish. Director Antoine Fuqua shot lots of the scenes at nighttime, and the heavy darkness and shadows convey the dark tone of the film and made a lot of the scenes visually impactful. But when you boil it all down, what makes The Equalizer a superior action movie is that it's basically a superhero story for our time. A normal looking guy or a normal seeming guy witnesses people in trouble or who have been wronged, or they're people who are going down the wrong path, and he has the necessary skill set to solve their problems or set them back on the right path again, even if this means solving the problem in the most brutal and badass way possible, and with no consequences apparently. I mean, it's kind of cheesy stuff, but for an action movie it works. But less awesome is The Sequelizer 2, which is exactly what you expect the sequel to be. The movie starts off on a train headed to Istanbul, where McCall is going incognito, tracking down a man who took his daughter overseas to retaliate against his ex-wife in some kind of nasty custody battle. So right away we're taken out of the movie because it's outside the confines of what would even be considered remotely realistic. Like, why is he tracking down this missing girl? Who is she to him? And best of all, this whole scene just sets up an action scene given away in the trailer, and we find out it has no bearing on the rest of the plot. A lot of the film is actually like this, and it just ends up overstuffing and dragging down the plot. We learn that McCall is now a Lyft driver, in what may be both the best and worst product placement in a movie ever. The whole Lyft thing is just to set up more side stories and action scenes that are pointless to overall plot, like the subplot involving an elderly man who McCall befriends, who was looking for his lost sister after they got separated during World War II, or the subplot involving a group of young guys who brutalized a young prostitute and had the misfortune of booking McCall's Lyft to take her home. There's also Miles, who's a young art student who lives in the same apartment complex as McCall. Miles is essentially the Terry character from the first movie. This time he's skipping classes to hang out with his drug dealer friends because the drug money pays the bills. McCall can't stand to see him waste his artistic talents, and there are a lot of motivational type scenes where he helps to set Miles straight. These are some of the better scenes in the movie, but again, they don't have much bearing on the main plot, which concerns Melissa Leo's character, who we remember was a retired agency agency operative who, for some reason, is still actively involved in these top secret government ongoings. She even visits a crime scene of a couple in Belgium who got murdered. Isn't she retired? Why is she still allowed to investigate crime scenes? How does she still have access to all this information? And above all, why does she still keep in contact with McCall when, as we learned in the last movie, McCall was an ex-assassin because they faked his death to get him out of the agency? Anyways, Melissa Leo gets attacked and killed in her hotel room, which devastates McCall and puts him on the path for revenge. So it turns out that agency operative and former partner of McCall is played by Pedro Pascal, and this guy turns out to be the bad guy, and he's like the most boring bad guy ever. He and his goons are out to kill off former agency operatives for no real reason. I guess there were more of these agency assassins, and they want to tie up loose ends. There's this huge exposition dump about 2/3 of the way through the movie that has Pedro Pascal explaining his motivations, but he ends up just saying a lot of nothing. So the whole motivation for killing off all these other agency people is basically pointless and makes absolutely no sense. So yeah, the plot is unfocused and has way too much going on, but making things worse is that the characters are also no longer well defined or act in logical ways. Denzel still gives the best performance, obviously, but the McCall character grows more and more ridiculous as the movie goes on. He can take out bad guys and dispense justice so efficiently that there are apparently no consequences whatsoever. He can just go into a drug dealer's den, barge into a meeting with a group of armed thugs, and somehow just intimidates them into leaving him alone. Also, he's involved in so many altercations and shows up in so many numerous locations where someone would have noticed him. Are there no surveillance cameras anywhere in this world? Can no one track this guy? Is he completely invisible? Does he not leave fingerprints everywhere? Even the movie's action finale is disappointing and makes no sense. It takes place in a deserted coastal town that's being ravaged by a hurricane. Why are they fighting in a hurricane? Is it supposed to be symbolic of something? Is it supposed to add tension to an otherwise tensionless scene? I mean, there isn't even a good kill count. There's only 4 bad guys, and all of them are bad guys we don't really care about, so what's the point? And perhaps the most irritating thing about the movie is that it spoon feeds the audience information. A lot of the character moments just show up as moments to remind you of the first one. They show him reading, they show him using that stopwatch on his watch, they show him doing the whole OCD thing. They only show these moments once or twice each, and then they just disappear from the rest of the movie. They even spoon feed the movie's themes to us. As established, the first Equalizer is basically a superhero story, but with an everyday kind of hero. But at the end of this movie, they have a scene where Miles is sketching in his sketchbook, and a girl asks him what he's drawing, and he says he's drawing an everyday superhero. I mean, it's not like the movie's themes were obvious or anything like that. That would simply be ridiculous. So, long story short, the Equalizer 2 is not nearly as good as the first one. So if you enjoyed the first one, you may still enjoy it for Denzel's performance, but if they ever make Equalizer 3, I really hope it's better than this one.